Frank gave me a choice of standing there or sitting here, and I'd rather sit here. So when you've been working on these issues as long as I have, new things and new experiences don't come that often. But I was just telling Lynn that I recently had a book published in Esperanto. How many of you know authors who've published in Esperanto? I had another new experience yesterday. I'd been invited some weeks ago to come and spend a couple of hours at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. The interesting thing about this is that I was picked up by an agent at my office, driven to the site, and accompanied the entire time and all the way back to my office. I wasn't blindfolded, but it was an interesting experience to see the office building that houses this organization of 5,500 employees. It is a quarter of a mile long. It's way out in Virginia, but it was another new experience. One thing that you didn't mention, Frank, is that on my biography, in 1949, I was Cumberland County, New Jersey junior tomato picking champion.
The highlight of your career.
As it turns out, yes. I'd like to look at, not precisely at biofuels, but the importance of the biofuel issue in the world food economy. We did last year convert 129 million tons of grain into ethanol. We produce normally close to 400 million tons of grain in this country each year. So that the share going to biofuel is roughly 30%. Last year, the amount of grain going to biofuel exceeded the amount of grain being used to feed livestock and poultry. So we're now diverting more grain to fuel than to feed, and the lines have crossed. The other thing is, I mean, just to try to get the 129 million tons in perspective, that's more grain than Russia produces. It is sizable. So we have taken out of the food feed economy a chunk of grain that it's as though Russia had disappeared from the face of the earth in terms of production. So it's not, the amount of grain we're converting into fuel for cars is not inconsequential. And the 129 million tons is certainly enough to raise food prices worldwide. Now, in this country, we don't really feel this. The price of grain doubles, and the value of the wheat in a loaf of bread, which was 10 cents before the price of grain doubled, is now 20 cents. Most of the price of a loaf of grain, which is, I don't know, $3 now maybe, very little of that is the original raw material. So if the price of wheat doubles, we really don't feel much of an increase in prices. But if you live in New Delhi and you go to the market and buy wheat to make chapatis, if the world price of wheat doubles, the price of your chapatis double, because basically you're bringing home the wheat and grinding it and making the chapatis. So low-income people around the world are much more affected by this massive chunk of grain that we're now using to produce fuel. And it's beginning to have some consequences that we've not seen before, at least not on the scale that we now have. In the past, when food supplies tightened, the low-income segments of world society reduced the number of meals per day to one. They would have just one meal per day. But now we see a new sort of phenomenon, which is foodless days. A survey conducted a year or so ago in a number of countries showed that in Nigeria, for example, 27% of all families now routinely plan foodless days. They simply cannot afford to eat every day. In India, 24% of families no longer can eat every day. In Peru, it's 14%. I think Ethiopia was 20%. But the point is that we're moving into a new situation now in terms of the adequacy of the food supply. And when there's not enough of grain to go around at current prices, price goes up and the market rations the supply, and that's what we're seeing. Why are we in so much trouble on the food front now? I mean, biofuels is obviously the diversion of 129 million tons of grain to the production of biofuels in this country is obviously a major factor. The other two sources of growth in the demand for grain are, one, population growth, which is obviously not new. That's 80 million people a year. There will be 219,000 people at the dinner table tonight who were not there last night. And this is sort of relentless. It just sort of keeps going on and on. The other source of growth in the demand for grain, and this past year it may have eclipsed the growth in demand from population. If not, it was very close to it. And that is moving up the food chain. The difference between grain consumption in India, where people consume about 400 pounds of grain per person per year, or roughly a pound a day, and the United States, where we consume about 1,600 pounds of grain per year, most of it indirectly in the form of meat, milk, and eggs. That's a difference of 4 to 1. So when people ask me how many people can the world feed, I always ask at what level of consumption, because if it's at the US level of consumption, it's about 2.5 billion. If it's at the Indian level of consumption, it's about 10 billion. So rising affluence is now a major source of growth in the demand for grain. And we see it most dramatically in China, which now consumes twice as much meat as the United States. And it's not been long ago that they were not consuming much meat at all. One of the consequences of this massive movement up the food chain is that the demand for corn has expanded much more than that for wheat or rice. Corn is our feed grain, and world production now is about 900 million tons a year. Wheat and rice are our food grains. Wheat's about 650 million tons, rice about 450 million tons. So corn, 900 million tons, wheat, 650, rice, 450. I'm obviously rounding a bit, but just trying to give a sense of the overall perspective. The net effect of so many people moving up the food chain and of using grain to fuel cars is that the annual growth in the demand for grain has doubled over the last decade. A decade ago, the annual growth in world grain consumption was about 21 million tons a year. In the last few years, it's been 41 million tons a year. So in absolute terms, we're seeing much greater growth in demand. So then the question is, how do things look on the supply side of the equation? And we're now seeing some new, farmers are seeing some new challenges, new constraints. One is water shortages. Water shortages aren't entirely new, but water shortages on the scale we're seeing today are unique. Climate change, soil erosion, hitting a glass ceiling on grain yields. These are the things that are making it more difficult for farmers to keep up with what is now record growth in the demand for grain. Half of us live in countries where water tables are falling as a result of overpumping. That includes the big three grain producers, China, India, and the United States. The World Bank estimates that in India, 175 million people are being fed with grain produced by overpumping. My estimate for China is 120 million. And in the US, in both Texas and California, our two largest agricultural states, we're seeing a steady shrinkage of the irrigated area. In Texas, mostly because the wells are going dry. They're pumping on the thin end, southern end of the Ogallala aquifer, and that, as you know, is a fossil aquifer. And in California, it's partly wells going dry, but also substantially irrigation water being diverted to cities. Cities can pay much more for water than farmers can. So in that competition, agriculture always loses. We are now seeing for the first time a sub-region of the world with declining grain production as a result of water shortages, and that sub-region is the Arab Middle East. That would be Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria are the principal countries, Jordan. But in those countries, grain production is now falling, not only falling, but falling at a fairly substantial rate because the wells are going dry. In some cases, Saudi Arabia, they've been pumping principally a fossil aquifer, and it's almost gone now. And so as it goes, so will their wheat production go. For the first time, we've seen a sub-region of the world where grain production is now falling year after year as a result of shrinking water supplies. With climate change, there's a lot here we don't know yet, but we do have a rule of thumb that for every 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature, we can expect a 10% decline in grain yields. That's been the traditional rule of thumb. A recent empirically based study drawing on data from a number of counties in the United States, hundreds of counties in fact, study from Stanford indicates that we may be, instead of a 10% decline for each 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature, we may be looking at more like a 16% decline in grain yields as a result of a 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature. It's instructive to look at the relationship between temperature and photosynthesis, because that is the bottom line after all. If I can remember these numbers, and I've made a few notes here, as temperature rises, so do yields, up to 68 degrees. And then from 68 degrees to 95 degrees, there's no further increase in yields. Yields plateau. So yields rise up to 68 degrees, then they level off to 95 degrees, then they begin to drop. And from 95 degrees to 104 degrees, they drop to zero. Once you get to 104 degrees as an average temperature, plants go into thermal shock, and there's no photosynthesis, and that's basically it. So as temperature edges up, it will affect grain yields adversely unless we can somehow offset it through plant breeding, which we're trying to do, but we don't know quite how successful we will be. The other thing that farmers are facing now is climate change. I mean, as a former farmer 50 years ago, our crops, in my case tomatoes, were affected by rainfall. And we also had supplemental sprinkler irrigation we could bring to play when needed. But forgotten where I was going with that. The main point is that the agricultural system we now have evolved over an 11,000-year period of rather remarkable climate stability. And now suddenly, the climate system is changing. And so the agricultural system and the climate system with each passing year are more and more out of sync with each other. And farmers can't do much about it because they can't anticipate the changes that begin changing crops or what have you, because we don't know. We don't have enough information to be able to support long-term planning in agriculture based on changes in climate. We don't have the data at the local level to guide that process. We also now have more soil erosion than at any time in history. We had a Dust Bowl in this country back in the 30s. We knew what we had to do to get it under control. Some of the land went back to grass, and then we began contouring shelter belts, a whole package of practices that enabled us to make sure that Dust Bowl was short-lived. It lasted just for a matter of years. And then in the late 50s, the Russians, with their New Lands project and their Khrushchev's idea of burying the U.S. in productivity, led to a Dust Bowl there in the New Lands project. And the Soviets realized they had to pull back. And they did, and that Dust Bowl came to an end. There are now two Dust Bowls forming in the world, both far larger than either the ones in the U.S. in the 30s or the one in Russia in the late 1950s. And those are in northern China. The northern part of China is becoming a huge Dust Bowl. And it's not so much because of overplowing, it's because of overgrazing. And the vegetation is simply being destroyed. Both the United States, China and the United States have comparable grazing capacities as countries. Both countries have nearly 100 million head of cattle. The U.S. has 9 million sheep and goats. China has 284 million sheep and goats. So they're literally just destroying the vegetation throughout northern China. And it's a problem the government seems to be politically unable to deal with because of the potential unrest it would cause if they tried to reduce flocks to a sustainable level. I mean, it would take a huge reduction, and they're just not able to take on that challenge. So we have water shortages, we have climate change, we have soil erosion, and now we have something called we're hitting the glass ceiling with grain yields. And it's surprising how clear-cut it is. We've seen it with rice in Japan and South Korea, raising rice yields for decades, and suddenly, about 15 years ago, they stopped rising and they've been flat as a pancake since then. And China is just now hitting the same yields that Japan has, and unless China can take its rice yields above those in Japan, which I don't think will happen, then China's also hitting that glass ceiling on rice yields. In Europe, if you look at wheat yields in the big three producers, France, Germany, and the UK, all three look exactly the same. They have been flat now for more than a decade. And in none of these countries that have hit the glass ceiling has anyone been able to break out of it, because they're being boxed in by the limits of photosynthesis itself. And unless someone can figure out a process that's more efficient than photosynthesis or somehow modify photosynthesis, which is not an easy thing, we're going to have to face the reality of more and more agriculturally advanced countries hitting these glass ceilings. How's my time going? Just a question of what do we do about these things to try to maintain stability in the world food economy? Well, number one is abandon the idea of producing biofuels. That was, at least from food and feed crops, that was a bad idea to begin with, and it's an even worse idea now, given the tightening that has occurred. I mean, I remember 1978 when the program was initially started, it seemed like a good idea. We had excess capacity, and we were paying farmers not to plant on some of their land. But biofuels didn't really go anywhere until after Katrina. And after Katrina, because of disruption of oil refining in the Gulf, then suddenly the price of gasoline went way up, and then it became quite profitable to convert $2 a bushel corn into ethanol. So we had this orgy of investment in the 2005-2010 period. Most of the ethanol distilleries were built during that time. So that's one we have to get rid of. The second is, I think we need a worldwide effort to raise water productivity. The interesting thing is, we have been focused on land productivity for a long, long time. And we measure land productivity in bushels per acre or tons per hectare, but we don't have a measure of water productivity. How many tons of grain, of water per ton of grain, for example? It's not part of our mindset. It's not something we think of. What is the water productivity of water used for rice production in Southeast Asia or for wheat production in Egypt, for example? We haven't begun to think about water productivity, but we need to, because it's water, not land, that is now the principal constraint on efforts to expand world food production. So raising water productivity is a key, and the key measure is beginning to price water at its real value. I mean, we have been treating water as a free good for so long, we tend to think it's still free. It's not. Water is now a very valuable resource. Then we have to stabilize population. And it's not as difficult as it would seem to be. And it goes hand in hand with eradicating poverty. There are millions of women in the world today who want to plan their families but who do not have access to family planning services. Just getting them the services they want would take care of much of the population growth in the world today. It wouldn't take care of all of it, but would take care of much of it. And then we've got to cut carbon emissions. Political leaders, I mean, climate is a major threat to future food security. I don't think we can even begin to imagine the consequences of continually rising temperature and the shifts in the Earth's climate system that will bring. As I mentioned earlier, it means with each passing year, the agricultural system and the climate system will be more and more out of sync with each other. And there are other consequences that we've hardly begun to measure. A modest rise in sea level would not have a major effect on U.S. agricultural production, but it would affect rice production in Asia because so much rice is produced in river deltas, like in Vietnam, for example, or the Ganges, or other river deltas in Asia. Political leaders talk about cutting carbon emissions 80% by 2050. That's politically convenient, but I think it's also irrelevant. If we stay with that, the game will be over long before 2050. I think we have to cut carbon emissions 80% by 2020. And this really is more like a wartime mobilization. But we need a wartime-like mobilization. I can, along with perhaps a few of you, remember 1942, when we totally restructured the U.S. industrial economy in a matter of months. And the key, I mean, Roosevelt in his State of the Union address, January 6, 1942, a month after Pearl Harbor, said, we're going to produce 45,000 tanks and 60,000 planes and, I don't know, 20,000 artillery guns. He was just laying it out, and people couldn't imagine how we could do that. But what he did was then ban the sale of cars, of new cars in the United States. So the automobile industry had no choice but to produce tanks and planes. And we totally restructured the U.S. industrial economy in a matter of months. Not decades, not years, months. And we could do the same thing today if we understood the urgency of doing so. And instead of producing cars, we'd be producing wind turbines on assembly lines, for example. Huge amount of wind in the world. We could easily run our economy on wind energy, and probably the wind energy in Texas alone would be enough to run the U.S. economy. So we have an enormous amount of wind. No question about the abundance or the harnessability. And we're seeing wind begin to expand now rapidly. China, for example, now has 8 wind mega complexes under development, which will have at least 20,000 megawatts of generating capacity. 8 of these. I'll wrap up with this. 8 of these wind farms, the largest of which is in Inner Mongolia. It has will have a generating capacity when completed of 38,000 megawatts. That's like 38 nuclear power plants. That's enough electricity to satisfy the needs of a country like Poland. So wind scales up like no energy source we've seen before. It doesn't scale down. You can't put a wind turbine on your rooftop and expect it to satisfy your needs. But scaling up, it really is literally a lifesaver. And that's where I think we need to be headed. And I think wind will be the centerpiece of the new energy economy.
Lester, thank you. You did exactly what we hoped you'd do, and that is to relate our food production and our food needs and our ability to meet those needs in the light of competing demands, including those, particularly those of climate change activities and shifts of fuel sources.